Picture this. It is the summer of 1806. You wake up, you walk outside, you look up at the sky, and there is no sun, not clouds, not fog, not a regular Tuesday morning in Seattle kind of gray. No, the sky is yellow, like the world is sick, like the atmosphere itself is running a fever. It is June. It is supposed to be warm, but there is frost on the ground, ice on the ponds, snow falling in New England in the middle of July, and nobody, not a single person alive on planet Earth, knows why. Okay, go ahead. Dim those lights. Pull that blanket up. Get comfortable. Maybe grab some water. Maybe put the phone face down. We are about to go somewhere wild tonight. Somewhere dark and beautiful and completely insane. And I promise, by the time this is over, you will never look at a cloudy summer day the same way again. Hey you. Yeah, you. Yeah, you. Welcome back. Or welcome for the first time. Either way, glad you're here. Get cozy. Settle in. This is your story for tonight. No jump scares, no stress. Just history. Weird, wild, unbelievable history. Told the way it should be told. Slowly. Like we've got nowhere to be. Because we don't. It's bedtime. The dishes can wait. The emails can wait. Everything can wait. Tonight we are going back to a summer that broke the world. A summer nobody photographed because cameras hadn't been invented yet. Which honestly kind of makes it spookier. Because the only records we have are the words people wrote down. Desperate words. Confused words. Scared words. Diary entries and newspaper clippings and letters that said things like, I have never seen anything like this in all my years of living. And these were not dramatic people. These were farmers, ministers, regular folks, people who were not in the habit of overreacting. And they were absolutely losing their minds. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's go back even further than 1816. Let's go back to the place where this whole story was born. A tiny island in Indonesia, a mountain so tall it scraped the clouds, a mountain that had been completely, peacefully, quietly asleep for centuries. And then, one day, it wasn't. The island is called Sumbawa. It's in the Dutch East Indies, which is what people called Indonesia before Indonesia had a name. If you've never heard of Sumbawa, that's okay. Not many people had. It was beautiful in that quiet, ignored kind of way, green and tropical and full of life. And sitting right in the middle of it like a sleeping giant was a mountain called Mount Tambora. Now, Tambora was not a small mountain. Before everything went wrong, it stood over 14,000 feet tall, which is big. That's almost 3 miles straight up into the sky. And for hundreds of years, it just sat there, quiet, peaceful, doing absolutely nothing, just being a mountain, minding its business, growing a little moss, letting birds nest on its slopes. People lived on Tambora, around Tambora. Near the base of the mountain were villages, farms, whole little kingdoms of people who had no reason to fear the ground beneath their feet. They had been living there for generations. Why would they leave? The land was fertile. The fishing was good, life was fine. The mountain was asleep until 1812. In 1812, very quietly, very slowly, almost like someone stirring in their sleep, Tambora started to rumble, just a little. A dark cloud appeared above the summit, just sitting there, hovering, like a warning nobody could read. There were some small pops, some distant tremors, ash floated down like dirty snow. But nothing serious happened, so people waited. and the mountain grumbled. And nothing happened. And people thought, okay, fine, the mountain is just being dramatic. Maybe it'll calm down. Maybe it's just a phase. It was not a phase. For 3 years, 3 whole years, Tambora kept rumbling and steaming and sending up small eruptions while everyone kind of just lived around it. This is actually one of the most human things in this whole story, the way people can normalize something terrifying if it happens slowly enough. The mountain has been rumbling for 3 years? Fine. That's just the mountain past the rice. It's been doing that thing again. And then came April 5th, 1850. That evening, as the sun was going down over the Indian Ocean, the mountain decided it was done being patient. There was a sudden explosion. An enormous burst of ash shot 18 miles straight up into the sky. Lava began streaming from the peak. People miles away heard what sounded like cannon fire and assumed, because Europe was in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars and everyone was jumpy, that someone was being attacked. British officers on the island of Java, over 1,000 miles away, actually sent soldiers out to investigate. They thought an enemy ship was bombarding a coastal town. It was not a ship. It was a mountain, just warming up. For the next several days, ash fell across Java, across Sulawesi, across islands hundreds of miles in every direction. The sky turned strange colors. Rumbling continued. And then, on the evening of April 10th, 5 days after the first big burst, Tambora stopped warming up and went full. At 7 o'clock in the evening, 3 massive columns of fire shot up from the summit and merged together into one enormous tower of destruction that reached into the upper atmosphere. The sound was heard over 1,600 miles away on the island of Sumatra. 1,600 miles. That's like standing in New York City and hearing an explosion in Denver. Witnesses nearby said the mountain became, in an instant, a mess of liquid fire, the pyroclastic flows. Those rivers of superheated gas and molten rock and pulverized mountain came screaming down the slopes at over 100 miles an hour and hit the villages below before anyone had time to do anything at all. The village of Tambora, the village that the mountain was named after, the place where people had been farming and fishing and living their lives for generations, was completely erased. 10,000 people gone in minutes. The explosion blasted more than 4,000 feet off the top of the mountain. That's not a typo. 4,000 feet gone. Like someone just snapped the top off the mountain and threw it into the atmosphere. What was left was a crater 4 miles wide and 2,000 feet deep. The mountain lost 1/3 of its height in one night. And everything that went up, all that rock, all that gas, all that sulfur dioxide and ash, it didn't just fall back down, it went up high enough to enter the stratosphere, the very upper layers of the atmosphere, where there's no rain to wash it down, where the winds can carry it anywhere, everywhere. Over the following weeks and months, a thin, invisible veil of volcanic ash and sulfur particles spread across the entire northern hemisphere. A veil so fine you couldn't see it, but thick enough to do something remarkable and terrible. It blocked the sun, not completely, not like night, but just enough to bring global temperatures down by somewhere between 1 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit on average, which doesn't sound like much. 1 degree, big deal. You can barely feel 1 degree, but for a planet that runs on incredibly precise seasonal timing, a planet where crops grow in specific temperature windows, where frost dates matter, where the difference between a good harvest and a dead harvest can be a matter of a few degrees. 1 degree is catastrophic, and nobody knew why it was happening. That's the part that really gets me every time I think about this story. The people of 1806 had no idea what was going on. They had no satellites, no global weather networks, no way to know that a mountain on an island thousands of miles away had essentially poisoned their sky. They just woke up one spring and noticed it wasn't getting warm. And they waited, and it got colder, and they couldn't explain it. So, let's go to America. Let's go to New England. Let's go to the place where this story gets deeply, weirdly, personally devastating. It is April of 1816. The winter has ended more or less normally. People are starting to think about planting. Farmers across Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, these folks were not wealthy. They were subsistence farmers. That means they grew what they ate. They didn't go to a grocery store. The grocery store was their field. If the field worked, they ate. If the field didn't work, well, April started cold, but that's not unusual in New England. Cold April is just April. Fine. People planted anyway because you have to plant when you have to plant. The growing season is short up there. You cannot afford to wait. May came, and it was. Strange. It was cold in a way that didn't feel right. A frost here and there, some ice on the ponds in the morning. Farmers frowned at their fields. They checked the soil. They looked at the sky with that particular kind of farmer squint that says, I don't like this, but I don't know what to do about it. And then June hit. June 6th, 1806, in New England. Snow, not a flurry, not a dusting. A real snowstorm in June, covering the green fields, killing the seedlings that had just barely poked their heads out of the ground. People woke up and stared out their windows with the kind of blank, silent horror that doesn't even produce words yet. You ever have one of those moments where something is so wrong that your brain just hasn't caught up, like the feeling hasn't arrived yet? That's what June 6th was for the farmers of New England. One man, a reverend named Thomas Robbins living in Connecticut, kept a very detailed diary. He was a calm, measured, religious man, not given to hysteria, and in his diary, around this time, you can feel him getting scared in his very restrained, polite, New England kind of way. He notes the cold, notes the frost, notes that it just isn't getting warm. He is clearly bothered, but trying not to panic, the way you try not to panic when your car is making a sound you've never heard before and you just really cannot afford a repair right now. By July, the situation was surreal. There were reports of ice forming on standing water overnight. In July, ice. In July, in New England, not Alaska. In some areas, it snowed in July. People started calling it the summer of mittens, which is both kind of adorable and absolutely horrifying depending on your perspective. If you think mittens in summer are charming, you were not a farmer in 1816. You were a city person with opinions. The crops that had survived June began to fail in July. Corn, which needs heat to grow, real summer heat, just stopped. It turned yellow and stunted. It grew no taller than your knee in some places, when it was supposed to be over your head by August. Wheat was thin and pale. Hay was barely worth cutting. Animals had nothing to eat, which meant animals died, which meant people had even less. By late summer, people were doing things that in normal times would be unthinkable. They were eating nettles, boiling wild greens that tasted terrible but were technically food. They were hunting hedgehogs. Hedgehogs. In Vermont, in America, people were eating hedgehogs. History books actually record this. Hedgehogs as a food source. In 1816, and the prices for actual food, flour, grain, meat went through the roof. Because when supply collapses and demand stays the same, prices don't just go up, they explode. Flour prices roughly tripled in some areas. For families already living close to the edge, this was not an inconvenience. This was survival. This was, do we eat or do we not eat? People started calling the year different things depending on where they lived. In New England, it was 1800 and froze to death. In some places, the poverty year. In others, simply the cold year. The Farmer's Almanac, which was supposed to be encouraging and helpful, was instead just Prater, not great bedtime reading that year. And here is where the story gets genuinely interesting in that dark, unintended consequences kind of way. A lot of people left, not just a few, thousands. Tens of thousands of New Englanders looking at their dead crops and their empty cellars and their impossible food prices made a decision. They looked west and they moved. The migration westward that historians usually talk about as this big, deliberate, optimistic expansion of America, a lot of that momentum in the early 1800s was actually driven by desperation, driven by a summer that didn't come, driven by a volcano on an island most of them had never heard of and couldn't have found on a map. Ohio got flooded with new settlers. Indiana, Illinois. People were leaving New England in droves, looking for land that might actually grow something. Land where maybe the summer worked like it was supposed to. This is the part of history that nobody tells you in school. The part where you realize that huge movements of people, migrations, cultural shifts, the shape of where Americans ended up living, weren't always the result of big ideas or manifest destiny speeches. Sometimes they were just the result of a mountain blowing up on the other side of the world and making July cold. History is wild, man. But the story doesn't end in New England. Let's float west for a second. Let's go to the places that were hit even harder. In Europe, things were bad in a very different way, because Europe in 1816 was already exhausted. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended. Napoleon had finally been defeated at Waterloo in June of 1815, just a couple of months after Tambora blew. And Europe, which had been at war for over 2 decades, was broken, and barely holding it together. And then the summer didn't come. In France, the harvest failed spectacularly. Grain prices in Paris went crazy. Bread, which was not a luxury for most French people, bread was basically the entire diet, became impossible to afford. Riots broke out. Not little protests, actual riots. People looting grain warehouses, people fighting over food in the streets of cities that had already been fighting over food during the revolution 30 years earlier. France had a very long and very painful history with bread shortages and what they tended to produce politically. The government was not amused. The people were furious. The crops were dead. In Ireland, which was already not having its best century, the cold and the rain brought a potato blight that caused widespread hunger. This is not the famous Great Famine. That came later in the 1840s, but 1816 planted the seeds of the idea that Irish agriculture was fragile. that dependence on a single crop in a cold, wet climate was a gamble, and that the gamble could be lost. In Germany and Switzerland there was flooding. Rivers burst their banks, roads became impassable. The Rhine flooded so badly that in some places entire sections of towns disappeared underwater. An observer traveling through Europe that fall noted that from Germany all the way down through France, bridges had been destroyed. Crops had rotted in standing water, and the roads, what remained of them, were clogged with people who had lost their homes. And then there was China, in the Yunnan province of southern China, a place that was normally warm and productive and known for its rich agriculture. 3 consecutive years of cold and flooding began in 1816. A poet named Li Yuyang lived through it and wrote about what he saw. He called his poems the poetry of the 7 sorrows, and they were not cheerful. He described famine, empty villages, fields that had once grown rice, now growing nothing but standing water. People selling children in exchange for food, not as a metaphor, as a thing that was actually happening. Because when people are desperate enough, truly desperately hungry enough, they make choices that break every other part of who they are. The year without a summer was not a quaint historical curiosity. It was a global catastrophe that killed somewhere in the range of 100,000 people or more, depending on how you count. And it was caused by a mountain that most of the world had never heard of, doing something that nobody on earth had any way to predict or prevent or explain. And here is the most beautiful and terrible part of all of this. While all of that suffering was happening, while New England farmers were boiling nettles and French people were rioting over bread and Chinese villagers were living through their 3rd freezing summer in a row, a small group of very dramatic, very famous, very extra people were sitting in a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And one of them was about to write one of the most influential books in the history of human culture. And she was 18 years old. Okay, still with me? Good. Let's keep going. Adjust the pillow. Breathe. We're moving now from the global to the personal. From the big picture to one very specific house, on one very specific lake, in the middle of one very specific ruined summer. Welcome to the Villa Diodati. The Villa Diodati sits on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, surrounded by vineyards on one side and the most aggressively beautiful mountain scenery you have ever seen on the other. It's the kind of place that makes you want to write poetry, whether you like poetry or not. It's the kind of place where rich, creative people rent for the summer because they have the money and the taste and the complete inability to sit still in a normal house. In May of 1816, Lord Byron rented it. Now, Lord Byron, we need to talk about Lord Byron for a second, because if this story was a Game of Thrones episode, Byron would be the morally complicated main character who you hate but can't stop watching. He was 27 years old. He was one of the most famous poets in the English-speaking world. He was impossibly good-looking. Reportedly, women fainted at a poetry reading. People fainted at poetry readings because of Lord Byron's face, which is either the most absurd thing you've ever heard or completely makes sense depending on how you feel about poetry. He was also, by the spring of 1816, in enormous trouble. His marriage had just collapsed. There were rumors. very loud, very public rumors about an affair with his own half-sister. There were rumors about basically everything because Byron collected scandals the way other people collect stamps. He was in debt. He was being mocked in the press. Society had essentially decided that Lord Byron was too much even for London, which in 1816 was not exactly a city of shrinking violets, so he left. He got on a boat, crossed the English Channel, and headed to Switzerland. Because when you are a dramatic romantic poet with too many enemies, the correct move is clearly to go somewhere beautiful and brood professionally by a lake. He brought his personal physician with him, a young man named John Polidori, 20 years old, a doctor who had actually been paid by Byron's publisher to keep a diary of their travels and essentially spy on Byron and write down everything interesting that happened, which, given that it was Byron, was a lot. Polidori idolized Byron. He also kind of couldn't stand Byron. He was starstruck and resentful in equal measure, which is an extremely relatable combination of feelings when you're 20 and working for someone much more famous and talented and charismatic than you. Poor Polidori. We'll come back to him. His story doesn't end happily. Byron rented the posh Villa Diodati up on the hill, and nearby in a smaller, much less grand house called Maison Chapuis, because they didn't have Byron money. Another group of English travellers settled in. They were Percy Bysshe Shelley, aged 23, also a famous poet, also very dramatic, also having a complicated personal life. Percy had recently abandoned his wife, his first wife, Harriet, who was still very much alive and very much not happy about being abandoned, to run off with the daughter of two famous radical intellectuals. That daughter was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, 18 years old. Not yet Mary Shelley. She wouldn't marry Percy for a few more months. She had already experienced more heartbreak in 18 years than most people encounter in a lifetime. Her mother, the legendary feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft, had died 10 days after Mary was born. Mary had already had a baby with Percy that died. She was carrying another child, their son William, who was just 4 months old. And then there was Claire Claremont, Mary's stepsister, also 18, also complicated. She had, and I cannot stress enough how messy this all was, recently had an affair with Byron herself, which is why she'd helped arrange this whole Geneva gathering. Byron was trying to politely avoid her. Claire was very much not being avoided. It was awkward. So you have this little cluster of brilliant, troubled, emotionally chaotic people. 2 famous poets, one overlooked doctor, one teenage genius, mother who hasn't written anything famous yet, and a stepsister who was basically holding the entire social situation together through sheer persistence. And then the summer didn't come. They had arrived expecting the kind of beautiful Swiss summer that shows up in postcards. Sparkling lake, warm breezes, wildflowers, boating, long golden evenings. Instead, they got rain. Constant, relentless, dark, cold, miserable rain. The kind of rain that doesn't feel refreshing or romantic. The kind that just grinds you down. The lake flooded. The roads turned to mud. The storms at night were violent and electric and incredibly dramatic, which at least suited the company. Day after day, they were stuck inside. Now, when you're a regular person stuck inside during a rainy summer, you watch Netflix and eat snacks and complain. When you are a group of the most creatively overheated people in early 19th century Europe, stuck inside during a ruined summer, you do something a little different. You read ghost stories out loud by the fire. That's what they did. They had a collection, a French anthology of German ghost stories called Phantasmagoriana, which is possibly the greatest book title in the history of publishing. They gathered around the fireplace, candles flickering, storms crashing outside, rain hammering the windows, and they took turns reading these stories. Dark stories, strange stories, stories about ghosts and death and the terrible things that happen to people who meddle with things they shouldn't. And then Byron, being Byron, looked around the room and said, in that casual, offhand way that famous charismatic people say things that sound like suggestions but are actually commands, we will each write a ghost story. Everyone agreed because you agreed with Byron. That was just how it worked. Percy Shelley started something, abandoned it almost immediately because Percy Shelley's follow-through on prose was not his strongest quality. He was better at poetry and long emotional walks. Byron wrote something, a fragment, a beginning of a vampire story, which he then also abandoned, because Byron's attention span for anything that wasn't Byron was famously short. Polidori took Byron's abandoned vampire idea, developed it significantly, and eventually turned it into a complete story called The Vampire, published a few years later. Became incredibly influential, is basically the grandfather of every romantic vampire story that has ever existed, from Bram Stoker's Dracula all the way to whatever vampire show is on television right now. Poor Polidori never got credit for it. It was initially published under Byron's name by mistake. Polidori was furious. Being young and underestimated and overlooked and working for someone more famous is one of history's most reliable formulas for misery, and Polidori had it in full measure. But the most important thing that happened in that villa that summer wasn't Byron. It wasn't Percy. It wasn't even the ghost story competition itself. It was a dream. Mary Godwin, 18 years old, exhausted, cooped up inside by a summer that refused to be summer, surrounded by brilliant men who all had more confidence than she did, was struggling. While the poets were generating ideas easily and loudly and with great flourish, Mary had nothing. She sat and thought and listened and felt increasingly like the least interesting person in a very interesting room. Then, one night, we don't know exactly which night, she had a nightmare. She described it later. In her own words, she said she saw a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. She saw the creature stir. She saw the horror on the creator's face at the realization that what he had built had become real. She woke up terrified, and then, instead of just trying to go back to sleep like a normal person, she thought, that's it. That's my story. She began writing the next morning. What she wrote would eventually become Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, published in 1818, one of the most important novels ever written, the book that arguably invented science fiction, the book that asked a question, what responsibility do we have for the things we create, that has never stopped being relevant. If you have ever watched a movie about artificial intelligence, or a story about a scientist who goes too far, or a tale about a creation that turns on its creator, you are in some way watching a story that Mary Shelley invented in her head during a ruined summer in Switzerland while the world outside was slowly starving. She was 18. She was 18 and she had already buried a child, and her mother was dead, and she was unmarried and slightly scandalized by association, and she was the only woman in a group of men who took up all the oxygen in every room they entered. And she wrote Frankenstein. I want you to just sit with that for a second. The summer wore on in its relentless, cold, grey way. The group at Villa Diodati did what very creative, very dramatic people do when trapped together. They talked. They debated. They had big conversations late into the night about science and philosophy and what it meant to be alive and what might happen if you tried to create life artificially. Galvanism was a hot topic at the time. Scientists had discovered that electrical currents applied to dead muscle tissue could make it contract, could make it twitch, could make a dead frog's leg kick, which sounds like a party trick but was actually blowing people's minds. Because if electricity could animate dead tissue, then what did that mean about the nature of life itself? Was life just electrical? Could you, theoretically, bring something back? This is what they were discussing. Mary was listening to all of it and building something in her head that was bigger and darker and more morally serious than any of them realized. Byron, meanwhile, wrote his own poem about the ruined summer. He called it Darkness. It begins with the line, "I had a dream which was not all a dream," and it describes a world where the sun has gone out, where people are huddled around fires, where everything is dying and cold and dark and civilization is collapsing, and in the end, Earth itself goes silent and black. He wrote it in 1816, the year the sun almost went out, the year the summer didn't come. He wasn't writing pure fantasy. He was writing what he saw outside. He was describing the actual sky. He dressed it up in cosmic metaphor, but the feeling underneath it, the cold, the dark, the wrongness of the air, that was real. That was the aerosol veil of Tambora blocking the sun, and Byron felt it, and he turned it into a poem, and it is one of the most haunting things he ever wrote. The summer ended. Eventually, the group at Villa Diodati dispersed. Percy and Mary and Claire went back to England. Byron headed south, toward Italy, toward Greece, toward more adventures and more scandals and the eventual unraveling that would come for all of them. And here is where I have to tell you what happened to them, because the story doesn't end at the villa. It continues, and it gets dark in a very different way. The kind of dark that doesn't need bad weather or volcanic ash, just time and loss. Percy Shelley drowned in 1822. He was 29 years old. His sailing boat went down in a storm off the coast of Italy. His body washed ashore days later. By the time it was recovered, it was unrecognizable. His friends cremated him on the beach. Byron stood and watched the fire. Mary was informed by letter. Byron died in 1824. He was 36. He had gone to Greece to help with the Greek War of Independence because he genuinely believed in the cause, and also because Lord Byron was constitutionally incapable of not being involved in dramatic historical events. He got sick. Fever, most likely. The swamps around the Greek town of Missolonghi were notoriously malarial. The doctors of the era, being very much doctors of the era, bled him repeatedly as treatment, which, as you might imagine, made everything worse. He died having given most of his fortune to the Greek cause. Complicated man. terrible decisions about medicine, but genuine in the end maybe. Polidori died in 1821. He was 25 years old. The official cause was listed as poisoning from prussic acid, a type of cyanide. Whether it was accidental or intentional, nobody knows for certain. Most historians believe it was suicide. He had struggled with depression for years. He had never really recovered from the experience of being Byron's overlooked sidekick, the butt of jokes among brilliant people, the one whose name nobody remembered even when his ideas were the ones that became famous. His vampire story inspired Bram Stoker. Dracula is, in some sense, John Polidori's ghost. Within 8 years of that summer, everyone who had sat around that fireplace, every man anyway, was dead. Percy drowned. Byron feverish. Polidori gone in the dark by his own hand. Mary lived until 1851, 35 years after that summer. She outlived all of them, and she felt that weight every day. She visited Villa Diodati again in her later years. She stood there, this older woman who had buried almost everyone she loved, a child, a stepsister, her husband, her friends, and looked at the place where it all started. She said in one of her letters that she saw herself as a companion of the dead. That phrase has never left me, a companion of the dead. She carried all of them with her, Percy and Byron and little William, who didn't survive childhood, and all the losses that stacked up over those decades. She carried them the way you carry people you've lost, quietly, constantly, in the way certain places or songs or smells will suddenly bring them back so sharp it takes your breath away. And she also carried Frankenstein, the creation she had made in that ruined summer, the book that would outlive her, that would outlive everyone, that is still being read, still being filmed, still being reimagined 200 years later. A story born from the worst summer in a century, born from volcanic ash and dead crops and storms over Lake Geneva and a nightmare and an 18-year-old girl who turned all that darkness into something that lasted forever. The world recovered from 1816, slowly. The ash settled, the aerosol veil thinned. By 1817, the summers came back, more or less. Crops grew again, prices stabilized, people stopped eating hedgehogs, but the echoes went on for years. The mass migrations westward in America continued. The population shifts in New England were permanent. Towns that emptied out in 1816 and 1807 never fully filled back up. The people who moved to Ohio and Indiana stayed, built lives, had kids. Their kids built more lives. The map of where Americans live and what states have what populations was shaped in some small but real way by a mountain that blew up in Indonesia. The famine in Europe contributed to economic instability that historians connect to the social upheavals of the 1820s and 1830s. The misery of 1816 didn't cause revolutions directly, but it fed into the exhaustion and the resentment that made revolutions feel necessary. And somewhere in a vault in Switzerland, metaphorically speaking, two immortal monsters were waiting, Frankenstein and his creature. The vampire, born in the haunted summer, children of darkness and cold and a young woman's nightmare. You know what the really beautiful thing is, though. Photography was invented in 1826, 10 years after 1816. The first surviving photograph in the world was taken in 1826 or 1827 by a Frenchman named Nicephore Niepce. It's a blurry, barely visible image of some rooftops in France. It's not impressive by our standards, but it is the first time a human being captured a permanent image of the physical world, which means 1816. The most photographically interesting summer in a century, maybe in history, with its yellow sky and its snow in June and its weird sulfurous haze, was the last great disaster that nobody photographed. We have words, we have paintings, we have diary entries and weather records and poems about darkness, we have Frankenstein, but no photographs. The summer nobody photographed is only known through what people chose to write down. And almost everything they wrote down was terror and confusion and grief. The farmers writing about frost in July, the politicians writing about food riots, the poets writing about a world going dark, the scientists trying desperately to explain why the sky was wrong, and coming up with theories about electricity and forest clearing because they had no idea about volcanoes and atmospheric chemistry. And then one quiet 18-year-old girl writing about a man who built a monster and couldn't control what he'd made, writing it slowly at a desk near a window while the rain came down outside and the lake turned gray and her brilliant companions slept off another long night of very important conversations. She didn't know she was writing science fiction's foundation. She was just trying to come up with something scary enough to win a competition. She more than won. Okay, that's the story. That is the summer nobody photographed. The year without a summer, 1800, and froze to death. The poverty year, the haunted summer. A mountain blew up in Indonesia. The sky turned yellow. Snow fell in New England in July. Farmers ate hedgehogs. Thousands starved. People moved west. Revolutions simmered. And a group of very dramatic English people sat in a beautiful villa by a Swiss lake, stuck inside by endless storms, and invented two of the most enduring monsters in the history of human storytelling. Frankenstein and the vampire, children of a volcanic winter, gifts from the worst summer in a century. If Tambora had never erupted, if that summer had been warm and lovely as planned, Lord Byron's group would have spent their days boating on the lake and having picnics and writing cheerful vacation poetry. They would not have been stuck inside. They would not have huddled around a fire reading ghost stories. They would not have proposed a competition to see who could write the most terrifying tale. Mary Shelley might have gone home in September having written nothing at all. Instead, she wrote Frankenstein, because the weather was bad, because a mountain blew up, because of a summer that nobody photographed. History is just. It's just absurd, man. The things that hinge on other things. The way one eruption on a tiny Indonesian island can move tens of thousands of Americans westward and also give birth to science fiction and also kill 3 brilliant young men within 8 years and also leave one brilliant young woman to spend the rest of her long life as, in her own words, a companion of the dead. It all connects. Everything connects. The volcano to the frost, to the hedgehogs, to the riots, to the villa, to the nightmare, to the book, to the monsters. Nothing happens in isolation. Nothing ever has. All right? That's enough history for one night. You can let your eyes close now. Let everything get heavy. The dishes are still waiting. The emails are still waiting. Everything is still waiting. But tonight, you went somewhere. You went back 200 years and stood in the shadow of a mountain that broke the world and watched a summer that never came, and sat by a fire in Switzerland with the people who turned the darkness into something that lasted. Not bad for a Tuesday night. Sleep well.